Welcome everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Renita. The presentation today basically going to speak to the broadband policy, highlighting some of Telkom's views on some topical questions raised. I wish to start by responding to the question of what does the proposed policy mean for South Africa? And Telkom envisages it to mean several things for different types of people in South Africa, and I want to speak to the vision. We don't think there's one ubiquitous vision that describes everyone in South Africa. We believe there's different communities, there's residential, there's business, there's different types of people in South Africa, and broadband is an enabler to provide a solution for each of these type of communities. And I'm going to just go through a few applications of the broadband, and I think it's important to focus on the end goal and what broadband ultimately means for the end user. So for the school learner, we have e-education. What the policy means is that instead of waiting for textbooks anymore, once the textbooks are digitized, they're delivered and downloaded to maybe a mobile device that the learner takes between home and school every day. It could mean fiber to the classroom, interactive whiteboards, where children in rural schools are taught remotely through expert teachers at a central point, or you'd be able to pool different schools into a regional hub. It can mean e-health. There are many examples in Africa of e-health already not even waiting for 3G broadband, just on 2G being used. So I'm going to start some of the examples which maybe not be off the top of your head. Health insurance sales via mobile phones like the M-Kesho in Kenya. Health education such as the United Nations Millennial Villages in Uganda, Rwanda and Kenya. You can use it by doctors to monitor incidents of contagious diseases and therefore monitor disease outbreaks as done in Rwanda. In Ghana and Kenya, the medicines have a little code on it. You enter it into your phone and then you get a report back as to whether these are legitimate medicines from the claimed manufacturer or they're counterfeit drugs. You can use broadband and health IT for just billing, scheduling, ordering of medicines. We know the logistics in South Africa, making sure when people go to hospitals that the AIDS or the ARV medications are there. E-care, which is basically electronic interchange of medical information, such that your experts in the, say, urban areas can look at your MRIs, your CT scans, X-rays of people in rural areas perhaps. Nursing call centers, medicine reminder SMSs, chronic medication pickups and repeats, monitoring that patients comply to their medications, and then the oft-touted patients' medical e-records, such that when they walk into hospitals, there's a digital finger recognition or other biometric ID, and you get the full medical history upon arrival in his hospital. The digital home is a vision where fiber's delivered to the home, not so much for broadband's sake, but for delivery of IPTV content. Fiber would link up multiple devices and television screens and just consumer applications within the home. This goes hand in hand with transition from broadcasting world to content services world, where users then watch television according to their own programming as opposed to the traditional linear programming. Then there's telepresence. This is where most of us in the corporate sector would have experienced this. You have virtual meetings, but it's not ubiquitous enough in society, and it needs to grow. We can grow to even virtual conferences maybe in future. There already are some podcasts like that, but it cuts down your greenhouse gases and your transport needs. There's e-government, and borrowing from the EU digital agenda means several things. It can mean e-voting. We see in many countries different levels of voting. Sometimes your national voting, as done in the UK and Estonia, primary voting as done in the States, municipal voting as in France and other countries. It can basically, it's a way in which your citizenry can access the vast array of e-government services. Smart cities. This is where broadband is ubiquitous in the city, such that your light and water meter readings are taken remotely. You don't have billing crises. Basically, you get your electricity bill in the post online. You can query and interact with it. You don't have long queues in the departments. Traffic lights sense the traffic on the roads, and then they adjust their phasing accordingly. Car accidents, by some cars reported embedded in vehicles, basically that link to the broadband grid, ensures that car accidents are reported as they happen. And then e-security, which is basically security in the home, security in the street, cameras monitored that police can track the streets remotely. What is the impact of this broadband policy on local government? Roy Kruger described the centralization of the rights away and the rapid deployment. Telkom sees that local government will continue with the usual provision of basic utilities. However, will start to digitize these services more and render services to the citizens. Basically, what we're saying is that it would be a great advancement if the application for these rights away and servitudes was similarly digitized, that a standard form is used in every municipality, an outlined standard process that you can track online where your application is in the process and have a history, see which department it falls in, the concurrency of other applications and all of this. A good example of this, I've shown just an example here, but if you go to have your tires changed at Malas Tires, they have a digital dashboard where you can see the status of every part of your tire being changed. What is the role of the broadband policy in the private sector? The broadband policy doesn't outline any specific role for the private sector. It makes it clear that government's primary delivery vehicles for broadband will be the state-owned companies, although this doesn't necessarily imply the private sector will not have a role. In the recent Honourable Minister of Communications budget vote speech, the Minister said, Telkom remains integral to the state's broadband ambitions of modernising and investing in its long-distance backbone network. Telkom envisages that the private sector will continue to build networks, increasing the speed and the footprint thereof, and/or alternatively engaging in price wars. I say this because there's a trade-off between investment in networks and monetizing the networks and gaining market share, and often expanding footprint and lowering prices can be conflicting objectives sometimes. Government will at some point need to make decisions into which areas government wishes the state-owned companies' networks to compete with those of the private sector. However, it is perhaps not controversial to presume that state-owned companies will utilize the infrastructure of the private operators, for example the masts, perhaps the fiber, where it wishes to build a network so as to lower build costs. What is the role of national government? Telkom foresees the role of national government as building a cohesive demand-side implementation plan which matches the supply side. This will require a multi-departmental alignment for implementation. So to repeat the theme, we see broadband as an enabler at the bottom and various verticals built within it. So you have your various departments which provide then the services of e-education, e-justice, which basically is your court rolls online, e-health, your e-citizen, such as the Who Am I project, and then any other department will have an easy implementation. On top of all of this, there needs to be a strategic and budgetary alignment so as to prevent wasteful expenditure, duplication, and there also will need to be an implementation oversight that coordinates all these efforts together. Most of those ideas are found in the broadband policy. How can this be implemented? Roy was earlier alluding to the broadband strategy and plan, which is currently under development. Although there are many things that can be done to improve efficiencies in the industry, ultimately to achieve universal service, being everyone having broadband maybe in a personalized or at least very close to broadband in a community center form, will require the intervention of government funding. So essentially, Telkom foresees it to be different visions which all need to come together into a set of solution requirements. And a solution requirement is that which spells out exactly what's going to be built to meet the needs of a user. It will include things such as the target pricing, the applications to be used, the usage and the demands on the network of those applications, the coverage, the technology. There will be economic studies dictating the affordability and the likely uptake of these solutions. Then there'll be the various roles of the state-owned companies and the private operators, and from all of this, one will be able to work out the funding shortfall. The enablers of this solution will be basically funding, your rights of way, your spectrum, and any legislative changes that may be required. Oversight through the Presidential Infrastructure Coordination Commission or the subcommittees thereof. So just briefly, I've outlined Telkom's views on what we think this broadband policy means for South Africa and the way forward, and I'll take questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Majoor. Is there any questions for Dr. Majoor at this point? Philip?
Specifically, what do you see Telkom's role as? Dr. Kruger mentioned that Telkom would be a major player by 2020. So in the societal business model there, what do you think is Telkom's specific role?
I don't think this is the appropriate forum for me to detail thoughts that are still being worked out. Naturally, what is stated would be regarded as strategic intent. So if you're saying what the specific role, that would be detailed in the broadband implementation plan and the broadband strategy, which still aren't in the public domain.
Let me rephrase it. Do you see yourself as enabling the digital citizen, or do you see yourself providing the services on the top end that would be, for example, the application part?
So Telkom's natural role today is the broadband pipe. Although we have a data center, we have cybernet operations and an IT part of our business, there is a risk that if Telkom were to not cultivate the demand side of the equation, that we may sit with networks that aren't optimally utilized. So that there's a self-interest for us to stimulate the demand side. Exactly what that may mean, if it's actually building solutions or merely working with government to align the solutions to the demand, I can't say right now. But I think the message is that Telkom can't just sit back and say, well, we've built this network, now everyone come. There is an inherent risk in that approach, and that the two should be hand in hand to create a balanced equation.
Hi, I just have a question from a citizenry perspective. Currently, property developers have the right to deny services to individual households in terms of complexes and so on. Now, when you look at, for example, where I stay, there's a whole lot of complexes that don't have services from a broadband perspective, because Telkom has dropped the box and now it's up to the property developer to take it to the individual households. Does the policy look at that to that degree, or is there anything that Telkom can do to look at regulating the property developers to enforce them to actually give us those services to our individual households within security estates and so on?
Okay, I don't have a single answer to this, but let me state a few things. Already there is the Electronic Communications Act. The Electronic Communications Act bestows upon every of the 500 ECNS licensees the right to enter upon public and private land and construct networks. In the MTN judgment last year, the High Court looked at the matter of such licensees negotiating with private landowners and said, look, as operators, you can't ride roughshod over the rights of the private landowners. The promotion of administrative justice and fairness must prevail. However, it is, and I don't wish to take a firm position here, but it is highly debatable whether those private property owners can deny you your service. That having been said, whether the service is wireless or fixed, I think is the matter. And then it comes down to, they can't jam the airwaves to prevent LTE services and satellite services to anyone in the gated community. But when it comes to trenching in the gated communities, well, there it may reasonability and must prevail. And so it comes down to what are the policies. And remember, the homeowners association represents supposedly all the tenants of the community. So you would be well advised to go to, when you bought that property, looking at the terms of sale. Did you buy the property with the express, was there anything spelt out in that? Sometimes Telkom goes to the edge of a community because the HOA itself has in the clause with the individual property buyers the condition that each individual property owner is responsible for provisioning the copper or the fiber to that distribution point. And that would be one of the fine prints in your point of sale. Nevertheless, you're quite welcome to go to Telkom and say, hey, we want services, and Telkom works on like a critical mass type thing, and we could then go negotiate with the HOA on mass. And the thing is, the HOA would only be interested in negotiating with Telkom if the majority of the tenants were to, basically request the services. So it's not a simple regime, and it depends on the individual facts of that particular gated community. I trust I've answered the question.
For under-serviced area, mostly rural area, there used to be copper lines going to some remote areas, but due to copper theft, it was not feasible to keep on replacing that copper. Is it not possible for Telkom to look at our installation of the fiber cables on top of the poles that were previously used for the copper cables?
Okay, if I can try. So you probably find a lot of rural areas, Telkom has fiber that runs through the village. And that is seldom the issue, provided the quality is good and all of that. It's connecting the people to the fiber that is problematic. And if you look at the typical capital requirement of a single point to the fiber, it can be about 20,000 Rand, for a high-end connection, which can be prohibitive for the users. So you find in those rural areas, a wireless solution would be more cost-effective. Now, Telkom has some spectrum in our toolbox currently. We are running an LTE network in 2.3 gigahertz, and it's quite fast. If people are clustered in an area, sort of a row, or there's a community center, or it's a limited area, then Telkom would have good spectrum. We've got 3G and 4G to cover that. However, if the people are like when you drive through the Transkei and the huts on every hill, like in a huge kilometer radius, then you really do need the 700 and 800 megahertz digital dividend spectrum to lower the costs of building those networks. And that spectrum is only going to become practically available late 2015, early 2016, dependent upon a multitude of processes. So Telkom is looking at it. However, the end objective is to try build networks in a cost-effective manner that basically not so much make a profit, but at least cover the costs of building those networks.
It seems you've answered my question. I was going to ask you on LTE. How far are you in terms of the rollout of the LTE as a broadband wireless technology?
Okay, so if you go to the ATA website, there is a coverage map, and you can see exactly where that is. If I'm not mistaken, I think we're still in the trial phase. I'm not sure if we've actually launched the product. We also have plans which I cannot release. We're on a closed period. I can't release commercially sensitive information, but that there will be other plans for LTE in future. The current solution that's sold is not so much a mobile solution, it's more a fixed wireless solution, but the speeds, it's dependent on the spectrum. We basically are using 60 megahertz, and it can give us about 80 megabits per second. However, to speak to the gentleman's rural thing, that LTE network is interfering with our own TDMA networks that we deployed for pair gain systems and basically point-to-point in other rural areas. So we're finding our frequency coordination of our own networks to be problematic.
Yeah, we see a lot of satellite operators here today, maybe 6 or 7. I wasn't here before at the beginning of your presentation. But what role do you see satellite playing in this plan for Telkom?
Okay. So basically, Telcom's role on broadband is that you've got to look at the user requirements, and you've got to have a solution that at least meets those requirements of the user. And satellite may not meet most of your urban requirements, your business requirements. It may meet a branch office, farms, mines, and rural communities where you'll find it. Also in the Northern Cape, the SKA, the radio blackout zone, satellite has a role to play. So it has a role to play, and basically you've got to make a decision between rolling out an LTE network and a satellite network, and then it becomes simply a cost trade-off type thing, and then you've got to look at whether it's Ka band or Ku band. And with satellite, the major cost for satellite appears to be the installation at each premise. And if that cost barrier can be overcome, then it is quite a good solution. However, as you may know, satellite is both mobile and satellite share the radio and the access, but the contention ratio on satellite is a lot higher than you would have with your fiber to the base station on a mobile network.